Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast, looking back at last weekend's Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, but also looking ahead to the undisputed crown jewel in Formula One, the Monaco Grand Prix, which does, of course, take place this weekend. From Racing News 365.com, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam Coop, and lead editor Ian Parks, who is so dedicated to this podcast. He's quite literally sitting in his car in Stansted Airport. So, Ian, we'll come to you first. How are you? How was the travelling? How was your car?
Travelling's fine. Yeah, very different background, as you can see, folks, as Nick said. So dedicated that we want to get this podcast wrapped up rather than waiting for me to get home, which is a 2.5 hour drive near enough. Unfortunately, these are some of the demands I have to go through to make sure I get a reasonable flight, reasonable times, etc., that I have to travel to a faraway airport in my car. So here I am at a coffee shop just on the outskirts of Stansted Airport, all ready to go home, but I'm here and I'm ready to get this done first.
The things we do for Racing News 365. Sam, we'll come to you first because obviously myself and Ian discussed Max Verstappen's win on Sunday in our F1 update video. If you haven't watched that, be sure to check it out on YouTube. It was for 90%, a dominant display by Max, but Lando Norris pushed him all the way in the closing stages.
Absolutely. It looked like a kind of routine Max Verstappen victory. And then all of a sudden, he didn't have an answer for this kind of onslaught that he was faced against. It was almost like, he's in Lando's crosshairs and it was a kind of, I've got no response here. I'm just praying that we get 63 laps before, Lando gets within DRS. And Lando himself said that I think 1 or 2 more laps and then I would have had him. So that's, that says how close it was. I think it was 0.7 seconds in the end. And I think there's a combination of things that happened over the weekend. Obviously, the setup struggles that Red Bull had on Friday, then having to adapt, it meant they didn't have the long run data that they usually would have for that kind of end point of the race on the hard tyres. So Max was saying that the lack of information meant that they were essentially going in kind of blind to that scenario. And that's why Lando was able to kind of continue to reel him in over that kind of last 10 laps or so.
Yeah, because despite the Max win, it wasn't, the kind of weekend from Red Bull that we've become known to seeing since the current regulations were introduced. But actually on that point, Ian, we ran a poll overnight to our audience if they thought Max Verstappen's win on Sunday was his best win since the current rules were introduced in 2022. And amazingly, 73% said yes. Would you agree with that?
It's certainly up there, bearing in mind what he went through over the course of that weekend, coming from not so much being nowhere on Friday, but as he described it himself, it was a bad day. Just struggling with that car, couldn't get it into the right window, right setup. And he came out of it with Helmut Marko describing him on Saturday as magical after his pole position, and Christian Horner describing him after the Grand Prix on Sunday as having produced a masterclass, bearing in mind what ultimately he went through over those closing laps. My counter argument to whether it was the best race from him or best win from him in this current era, and of course there are many, many to choose from, I'd go Miami last year, for bearing in mind he was 9th on the grid. He had to fight his way through cars, good number of front-running cars, and then he had to get past his teammate who had started on pole and must have almost certainly thought that this was a victory for him in the bag, given the disparity in the grid positions. And Checo was leading, for quite a portion of that race, but Max, just being Max, hunted him down and got that win. So I can understand from a front-running perspective why many people thought that was his best win, given everything that had happened over the weekend. But he was on pole, and he did ultimately win the race, pretty much from start to finish. Obviously, yes, there were a few laps here and there where he wasn't in the lead. But for me, I'd go Miami instead.
Well, for those who are watching on YouTube, let us know your thoughts in the comment section below. Was Imola Max's greatest win since 2022? Or do you agree with Ian and think it was perhaps Miami last season? We've got to talk about McLaren because obviously Lando got his win in Miami thanks to obviously a bit of luck, but a very heavily upgraded car. We questioned whether it was just a fluke or if McLaren's pace, which can compete with Red Bull, would continue into Imola. I think we can safely say that obviously Lando and Oscar, who had the full upgrades as well for Imola, that actually McLaren's pace is here to stay, and Red Bull, is it safe to say they do have a genuine threat, Sam?
I think you have to say that really at this stage, especially over one lap in qualifying. For both Lando and Oscar, admittedly on a difficult weekend for Red Bull, for them to be within a tenth of a second of Verstappen is mighty impressive. It shows the steps that McLaren have been able to take. The next thing is going to be able to, is putting that all together in a race. In the normal settings, obviously Miami was a bit of an outlier given the safety car scenario. So, yeah, I think we're certainly in a situation now where Red Bull can't rest on the laurels. They can't kind of say, look, we've been the dominant, preeminent force in F1 for 2-3 years now. We will find something somewhere. McLaren is a really credible threat, and Ferrari are also coming. So yeah, Sergio Perez is going to say after the race, look, we've got to get our heads down. We've got to keep on working. And he's absolutely right, because if they don't, it was still early in the season. This could not be all said and done at the end of the day.
And you got to think as well, guys, that we were a Nico Hulkenberg tow away from what could possibly have been an all McLaren front row. Of course, Yes, Oscar did get his penalty, but it was very nearly a 1-2. Bearing in mind when you think Oscar was 0.074 seconds away from Max, Lando 0.01 seconds away. So that tow that Max got was very powerful and in many respects race defining, because had Lando started on pole, let's take away the Piastri penalty now, because yes, he did hold up Kevin Magnussen in qualifying. So yes, he wouldn't have been on the front row, of course. But if Lando had been on a pole, what would have happened then? Would he have had the car to have held up or keep Max Verstappen at bay? Would he have had the car initially to pull away and then keep him at bay should he have ever have come under threat from Max? It's one of those hypotheticals that we will never know, but you've got to think that the pace was there in that McLaren, and once he got those tyres into that window, he was producing some almighty laps, as he did in Miami. So without a shadow of a doubt, McLaren is right there now with Red Bull, and that is something that team principal Christian Horner is very wary of, regarding after what he said post-race on Sunday in Imola.
A question to both of you then, because we've seen that McLaren have now got the pace to compete with Red Bull, and Ferrari as well are almost on that same level. Can we say that despite what we all expected coming into the season and after the first couple of rounds, do we have a title fight?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, I started to allude to it, I guess, at the end of my answer. I think how the next few rounds shake out will be everything. The issue is that while Zach Brown would argue otherwise and has argued otherwise, I still do think Max is operating at a higher, on a different level to the likes of, say, Lando Norris. I don't think Oscar Piastri would be in the title fight. Also, is there the case of, is Max already too far ahead? Has he got a comfortable enough buffer that even if McLaren do get, in kind of real terms, actual parity on race pace and performance, can Max just kind of eke that out? So I think there's two different things here. Are we going to have a close fight for the rest of the season, race to race? And whether or not that actually will ultimately end up in a title fight. I think definitely the former. I'd say potentially not the latter. I think Max will have just enough in reserve.
Yeah, he's certainly got a decent enough points buffer after these first 7 races, but we've got to remember that there's still 17 to go. That's a hell of a number of races. As I say, it's a good points buffer he's got now, and you've got to think there, with him making the difference with that RB20, then you've got to suggest that it's going to be his to lose from this point onwards. Yes, I do think that McLaren now are right in that mix. Ferrari are edging a hell of a lot closer. So maybe, Max might not get the number of wins that he got last season. He's going to be having to fight for those wins a hell of a lot more than he has to over the previous 2 seasons. It certainly makes for a more captivating and interesting rest of the campaign now compared to what we've seen over the past 2 years. But right now, I would suggest that there's just enough within Max, within Red Bull, within the RB20, that he's probably, going to come under a more significant challenge that he has done, but he's probably got enough in reserve to hold on. But we are going to see some really fascinating Grand Prix over the course of the rest of this year.
I'm going to throw my thoughts into this one because I do agree. I think it's, in terms of the Drivers' Championship, I can't see anyone other than Max. But I do think in the Constructors' Championship, that's where things could be really interesting because, okay, yes, Max is performing amazingly, but you look at McLaren, Lando and Oscar are both capable and have proven they're capable of finishing, towards the front. Ferrari have 2 great drivers in Leclerc and Sainz. And of course, while Sergio Perez is also a brilliant racing driver, we're seeing, similar to last season, he's kind of struggling a little bit with the RB20 and has obviously endured, a couple of frustrating races, but we'll talk more about Perez later on. So just to conclude then on Imola, Sam, have you got, what's your biggest takeaway?
Well, actually, my biggest takeaway is going to be piggybacking off your Perez comment, because my biggest takeaway is that on the most important weekend of the season for Sergio Perez in terms of McLaren, we know heading into Imola, we knew McLaren had taken a step. We knew that they would be there or thereabouts because of Miami. On the biggest weekend of the season, almost a season-defining weekend for how the rest of it's going to run, and within the context of not yet being signed up for 2025, a very dynamic driver market, in which there's Carlos Sainz there, there's a lot of factors at play. It was the worst possible time for Sergio Perez to have the weekend he had. Sorry, go on, Ian.
No. You finish up. Sorry, mate. I thought you had finished.
I just think that it's almost like when the pressure's on, when the moment really matters, he isn't there. It's well and good showing the form he did in the early stage of the season, and he was rightly praised for that. As many of us has pointed out, he was doing more than enough to keep his seat. Now is the critical moment, and that first big test, he wasn't there. So Monaco is going to be really, really key for Sergio.
And I was just going to piggyback off the back of that as well, Sam, because we've got to remember what happened last year, and we're almost beginning to see a carbon copy of 2023 when he and Max, one twos, and they split the opening 4 races between them, 2 wins apiece. Then we had Miami, which I've just discussed. Max's best win, coming from 9th, beating his teammate who started on pole. And then we went into Monaco, and you got the impression that after what had happened to Checo in Miami, his confidence was a little bit shot, and then he had that almighty crash. And that was really the real beginning of the end of his season last year. So now he comes into this Monaco with so much pressure on his shoulders yet again after another poor race preceding Miami last year. This year different because we didn't have Emilia Romagna last year. We didn't have Imola last year. Now we've got Emilia Romagna going into Monaco. How is he going to fare this time? He needs the cleanest of clean weekends to absolutely get himself back on track again. And you've got to feel if he doesn't have that, then those little alarm bells are going to start ringing in the back of the minds of Christian Horner and Helmut Marko, who may have been thinking after the first few races of this year, Checo's looking all right. Maybe we do have a bit of a dilemma on our hands for next season as to who's going to be our number 2 driver. Checo's played a perfectly good wingman role to Max over these past couple of years. He did, at the end of the day, finish second in last year's Drivers' Championship. But if these little alarm bells do start ringing in Monaco again, if he does something unbecoming, he crashed in FP3 in Imola. So, as I say, he needs the cleanest of clean weekends to eradicate any demons, not only going on in his own head, but that just might be starting to have a little word in the ear of Christian and Helmut.
And I suppose what doesn't help is that whilst we've kind of, removed him from being a contender, Yuki Tsunoda at RB is doing everything he possibly could to put himself in with contention. He's driving arguably the best he has ever done in his motorsport career. But as you've both gone on to Monaco, let's start talking Monaco, the one race on the calendar every single driver wants to win, the crown jewel. Sam, is Max the favourite?
I would say so. I think, obviously, we had a fitting and touching tribute to Ayrton Senna a couple of times over the weekend. And I think we're now going to kind of Senna's, I guess, adopted home in Monaco. And we've seen before Max's ability to string together one lap when really everything matters. And we know Monaco, it's all about qualifying. I think that, yes, McLaren may well be there. I know, we'll get onto the divisions and kind of the drivers' opinions on that in a bit, I'm sure. But I just trust Max to be able to string that lap together when it matters most, when the pressure is most on. So, yeah, for me, Max has to be the favourite there just because of, his ability to extract that perfect lap out of the car.
Ian, for you?
So the remarkable point is you've only got to look at the comments of Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris after the Imola GP. They were asked pretty much along the same lines as to how this package might perform with regard to the Monaco GP. I actually asked Oscar that specifically, bearing in mind these upgrades were introduced in Miami and just how well these upgrades have performed over these past two races. He was actually very upbeat. He's confident that that package is going to go well. But then you listen to Lando Norris in the top 3 press conference after the race, and he pointed out that without a shadow of a doubt, this package has proven itself in the medium and high-speed corners. Where it was slowest, he felt, or where it performed poorly, should I say, is in the slow-speed corners in Imola in particular. So if that's the case, bearing in mind Monaco's pretty much all slow speed, who do you believe? Do you look at Oscar and his confidence, or do you look at Lando? Is Lando being Lando, and we know how often he can underplay things, shall we say, and when then it all turns on its head go over the course of a weekend. So we've got an absolutely fascinating weekend in store without a shadow of a doubt when it comes to McLaren, because if they have got a car, judging by Oscar's confidence, that is good for Monaco, then they could very easily depose Max from pole position, front row of the grid, who knows. And then we are going to see, bearing in mind just how difficult it is to overtake at Monaco, we could very well see a McLaren victory at that circuit.
That would be something quite special. And that brings us on, I think, brilliantly to our bold predictions, because Ian, we need to let you get home. We also need you to finish this podcast with phone battery, which is also quite important for the upload, so we can get our audience.
I'm down to 3%.
Okay, very quickly, Ian, bold prediction, go.
For Monaco?
For Monaco.
I'm pretty much going to go back on what I've just said then. McLaren front row.
McLaren front row. Sam?
Ferrari will be stronger than McLaren.
I'm going to say a Charles Leclerc win at Monaco, because that would be celebrations all around. This has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast. Join myself and Ian this weekend for the Monaco Grand Prix F1 updates. See you later.